Okay, Sally, so today we're going to talk about getting the students to engage with feedback. So is there an issue, and if so, what do you think that issue is?
Well, anecdotally, people comment on the fact that in the days where people write written feedback onto written scripts, they have mountains of uncollected scripts, and they also reportedly find that students have had loads of electronic feedback and actually don't bother to read it, or so it is said. I think it is different in different subject areas. I think it is different from department to department, university to university, but there is a real problem that academics feel they're putting a lot of time into writing detailed, developmental, formative feedback, and then students come back to them with email questions which demonstrate they just haven't used it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also varies from student to students. I mean, some students that have really understood the value of feedback and know how to use it, there's no problem with engagement, is there? But there's a lot of students out there who haven't quite got it, have they?
So what does real engagement with feedback look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, because the idea that people are focused on getting, I mean, when it was written feedback, getting them to pick up that feedback, or to press the button online to access the feedback, and somehow that was taken as a measure of the students have engaged with it. But actually, what does that tell us? It doesn't tell us very much. It means that they've got it in their hands. Have they read it? If they've read it, what have they thought about what it means? Have they understood what it means? And if they've understood what it means, to what extent are they able to then integrate it into their learning? These are all much more important questions. I mean, clearly the first step is to get them to actually look at the feedback, but there's so many things beyond that if feedback is going to be as effective as it is, I say claimed to be, but ought to be, in helping students to improve their understanding.
So in terms of what we can do about it, I remember back in the olden days, a woman called Rachel Mole in the geography department at Northumbria used to run a little exercise in the first 6 weeks of the first semester of the first year, where she gave students little slips of paper that had comments off the bottom of previous year's students' essays, and she just said, rank them in order. Which one do you think is going to get a really top mark? Which one's going to get a low mark? And even that got students thinking about how they were going to actually use the feedback when they got. I've also heard of people who would give assignments with feedback on and would say to the students, can you guess what mark that means you're going to get? Obviously this is early programme stuff, but it's in that bit where we're developing students' assessment literacy.
Yeah, and I think early in a programme it's really important to, you know, even if you either model for them so that they can see how they might take feedback on one piece of work and move it to another, so using a series of exemplars or something, on actually requiring them to take their feedback and explain to you on a subsequent assignment how they've used it, which means that you've got something of an idea about how much they've understood and how much they have integrated it into their learning.
I'm very taken with that open university practice that says the next assignment there is an actual bit where you have to respond to the feedback, and I'm also interested in the whole idea of a bit of software called Assignment Handler, which means that you can release the assignments back with feedback on them to the students without marks, and the students have to respond to the feedback before they're allowed to have the marks. Now again, that can be, like everything you do with students, worked around, so the students can simply say thank you very much for the feedback, which I found very helpful, and then they'll get the marks.
Yes.
But at least it's developing an expectation among students that they will have to do something with the assessment. But there are other ways we can do this, aren't there?
Yes, I mean that's a similar idea to some places I know have feedback workshops. So students are given the feedback before, as you say, before they get the mark, and they actually have to enter into thinking about how well they've done, but also entering into a dialogue with each other and with the member of staff about what this feedback actually means. Because one of the things that came out of a piece of research I was involved in about, how do students engage with feedback, was the students' wish to enter into a dialogue about feedback, because a lot of them say we can't engage with this feedback because we don't fully understand it. It still needs that interpretation, and we need opportunities to discuss it. And many staff respond to that by saying, well, I say hey, come and talk to me. I'm in my office, or, on Monday afternoons. But actually, students also showed that they were very reluctant to do that because they knew staff were very busy and they didn't really want to bother them. And the staff actually offered each student a set appointment, got many more students to come and enter into that dialogue about feedback, and students reported it was very, very valuable. So I think that's important. And I think one of the other things that we need to do to help students get utility from their feedback, because that was another thing they said they wanted and needed, was to be much clearer about where they could take that feedback and feed it forward, because they often get feedback at the end of a module and they don't really know which modules are coming up next and where that particular feedback is probably going to be most relevant. We should have a better picture, or we should have a picture of the whole programme, which we can then help the students to anticipate much more about how useful that feedback is going to be, even if it's saying, okay, this piece of feedback you may not find useful until you're doing your dissertation, but at least that gives them the signal that say, keep hold of it, don't forget about it.
And I'm going to hop back to your point you made a couple of minutes ago about having timed appointments for students. I like the idea of students coming in bunches so that you're time efficient with it, but I'm also like the idea of you going into a lecture and saying at the beginning of the lecture, thank you very much for handing in your assignment, and actually doing a debrief on the assignment within the lecture. So they're in a position where they can't escape, and that they're actually going to hear you saying, and this was a good answer because, and what's wrong with this graph, and all those kinds of things that actually make feedback a shared experience. And I think sometimes, again, particularly early programme, we have to make sure that students just can't escape from the feedback.
I mean, something similar to that is, when you've got a bunch of marking in, you can sort of mark a few of them and get a real feel for it. So you can then produce some generic feedback and maybe present it the week after they've handed in, and then ask them to think about their own piece of work in relation to that generic feedback. If you like, to generate their own feedback on their work, and that they will then engage with the feedback you give them to say, how much did that fit in with what I thought? So it's all about getting them to be actively involved, and obviously getting to the stage where they understand quality well enough to be able to self-assess their work. Students that are required to self-assess their work have a starting point to start thinking about, well, how well did my self-assessment fit with what the member of staff said when they give me this feedback? And it also helps with a basis for dialogue too.
Yes, and sometimes people used to say in the days when we had paper-based feedback as the main way of giving it, that students never read the feedback. Is it any better with the electronic feedback, do you think, Margaret?
To be honest, I think the jury's out on that. I mean, I do hear that students who receive audio feedback or videoed feedback really like it because staff can get more said than they have time to write, and they can hear the intonation in the voice as well. Sometimes not good because it's frustration, and sometimes really sort of sympathetic. And students also say that they will listen to it more times, and they also seem to be able to file it better, whereas written feedback or hard copy feedback, students sort of say, well, I put it in a drawer, and maybe don't remember how to access that. So
yes, Bob Rotherham's Sounds Good project, which was a JISC project, suggested that with audio feedback that they received as an MP3 file, they'd listen to between 2 and 17 times, whereas written feedback they'd read between 1 and 2 times. So that was very interesting.
And I wonder whether it helps them to get a broader picture of all their feedback as well. So they hear a comment on one audio feedback and it resonates when they hear something similar in another. I mean, it should do for written feedback, but it's different students respond to different types of feedback, don't they?
And the key thing we're trying to do is trying to make sure that all the work that we put in to giving students detailed developmental formative feedback actually has some benefit because they do something with it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the ideal.